By way of announcement beforehand, after church is over this morning, we need to bring two tables down here to the front from in the back. So if anybody wants to help with that. And also, it would be really helpful if we could, any pew that's the first three. So back to mom and dad and Judy, and then right behind Virgil, everything off of those pews because we'll need to set boxes and that kind of stuff in there to start with. So if you've got anything like that, maybe move it or set it somewhere else so that we'll be able to operate this evening. There is a segment of the population that is probably 1 year older than me and 1 year younger than me and anywhere in between that grew up watching Eric Davis play baseball for the Cincinnati Reds. Some of y'all may remember Eric Davis for the Reds, but Eric Davis was a tall, lanky center fielder from Los Angeles, California. And when he batted, and it'd help if I had something bigger than this as a bat, but when he would bat, he would stand there with his hands low like this, and he would sort of twirl his wrists. And then as the pitch came, he would raise his left leg up, and he would drop his hands lower, and then he would swing. 1988, I think he hit 37 home runs and stole 100 bases. He was MVP candidate, was a great player. So as a 7, 8, 9-year-old playing in the yard and playing wiffle ball and playing ball at school, all of us wanted to hit like Davis. The problem was none of us were near as good as Eric Davis. And so when you're trying to do all of this stuff and you're twirling those wrists and did the leg get high enough? And then all of a sudden they've already thrown the ball back and strike one. Right? It's like, okay, got to focus a little quicker. Okay. Well, we tried to do that and failed miserably. And so when we got older, as we started playing league ball and summer league and then high school, you had to figure out a way that worked for you. And unfortunately, I never really did figure out the way that worked best, but we would try to figure out a way to bat. And when we watched 9 people on the team go up to bat, some people's bat was here, some was here, some crouched down, some stood up, some held it backwards, some held it forwards. We all found a way that sort of worked for us. None of those guys, though, played Major League Baseball. None of us were able to make it work as good as he was. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Well, from our earliest age, we imitate others. We imitate people that we grow up with, that we come in contact with. We imitate our parents or our friends or our family. But as Christians, I want us to think this morning, who do we imitate? Who is my Christian role model or example? And what if I'm being imitated? What example am I setting? So I want us to think about the question that's presented on the board. Is your example worth following? See, there was a handful of major league players that we all wanted to imitate, but there were some, I don't care who he is, we wanted to make sure that we were imitating the absolute best. But it would have been really neat if somebody came up to me and said, I saw you bat, and I want to bat just like you. So is our example worth following? We're going to look at 3 sort of overarching things here this morning, and I'm going to present a quiz for you near the end. First thing, who is your example? I want you to think about who is your example. Who do you follow? Who do you imitate? Well, let's start with the first one, because what did Paul say? He said, imitate me, but only as much as I Christ. So is it Jesus your example? Well, Jesus would certainly be the prime example for us, right? Paul had said that he was his example there as well. He should be our example for a few different ways. First, Romans chapter 15, verses 1, 2, and 3. Follow along with me. He said, when we then, who are strong, ought to bear with the scruples of the weak, and not to please ourselves, let each of us please his neighbor for his good, leading to edification. For even Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. When we think about who we are imitating, well, let Jesus be one, but our first goal should be to please or to help others that we would come in contact with. And so my imitation should be one that should be beneficial to other people. If it's still going to be Jesus, then let's look at a second thing. Jesus gave an example on how to love one another. Sometimes people struggle with that for whatever reasons that might be. But Ephesians chapter 5, the first two verses, therefore be imitators of God as dear children. Now stop there for just a second, because we just said that as children, we begin by imitating other people. We start by imitating other people. Paul said to the Ephesians, therefore be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet smelling aroma. And so Jesus taught us how that we should love other people. Think about the people that we read about in the Bible that came in contact with Jesus. Some of them were extremely happy to see him, hugged him, loved him. Some of them weren't happy to see him. Some of them treated him poorly. Some of them would ultimately be responsible for Jesus being put to death. But Jesus, as our example, showed how to love even those people. Well, guys, I'll be real honest with you. It's real easy to like the people that like me. It's a little harder to like those people that maybe don't like you, right? That's a little bit more of a challenge. But Jesus set that imitation, that example. Another one for Jesus, okay, well, how to look out for one another. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, we read, let each of you look out not only for his own, also for the interest of others. Now think about that for a second. How easy is it to look out for your own interest? We all do it, right? It's the reason that we get into the profession maybe that we get into. It's the reason that perhaps we change. It's the reason that we might maybe put a fence around the yard. It's a protection type thing. But I'm not always as worried about the interest of other people as I am myself. On Wednesday night, we talked about how Jesus, when he was performing these miracles, the apostles told him, and said, you need to stop, have something to eat. And he said, my food is far greater than this. Jesus was interested in teaching one more person before bedtime, and one more person before it's time to eat, one more person before anything else. He was looking out for the interest of others more than himself. Okay? Well, maybe you have an example of one of the apostles, and Paul is probably the apostle that we talk about, but you could have others as well. But Paul and all sorts of other New Testament Christians would fit as good examples. You can go through the Bible and you can pinpoint lots of different people that you would say would be a good example for you. Let's look at a few things that Paul did, or Paul wrote about to different churches that he was coming in contact with. To the Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we read him say, to give no offense to the Jews, to the Greeks, or the church, but to seek out the benefit of others so that they might be saved. Paul is saying right there is you can walk into a town and just start criticizing the Jew and you did this wrong, and the Greek, you did this wrong. But he said, go in there seeking to save those people, right? Go in there looking to work with them. That's an example that we would want to follow. Have you ever seen somebody, probably at work, maybe even a boss, who addressed the whole group, and when you saw him address, you thought, probably shouldn't have done it that way? Have you ever seen somebody do that before? Well, you realize that maybe the way that they approach those people wasn't the most effective way. We have to be mindful of that as Christians. And Paul's talking about that a couple thousand years ago, saying, when you go into the community, know who you're talking with. Be able to speak with. Set an example that would be worth following for those people, because your whole goal is to save those people. Paul wrote to the Philippians in chapter 3, verses 12 through 16. He said, don't consider yourselves perfect, but instead press towards a maturity and live according to what you have learned. Ever so often, we find ourselves thinking that we've got it all figured out, right? And usually about 10 minutes later, something awful happens and the whole thing unravels. The whole thing just sort of breaks apart. Well, he's telling the Philippians here, don't consider yourself perfected, because there's still room to grow. Do you know any Christian who has it all figured out? Do you know any Christian who does not have space for growth? Everybody does. From the first day Christian to the 1 millionth day Christian, and anywhere in between, there's room for growth. Paul said into the Philippians there, he said, you need to be maturing, right? Mature, not you have matured in all as well, but there's always maturity that has to happen. And that should be an example for us as well. He also wrote to the Thessalonians, he said, he commended them. He said, for receiving the word despite affliction. All the things that are going wrong, and they still said, you know what? All these things that are happening in our lives, but I am more interested in receiving the word. That's a good example for us to follow as well. Maybe your example then is other Christians today. People in this room provide examples quite often worthy of imitation. Now, I want you to think for just a second, and the quiz comes at the end, but I'm going to ask you to think right now for just a second. If there's one person in this church that you would like to imitate, who would it be? I counted 39 people here this morning. I would be interested to know what the answer to that question was. If you could imitate one person in this building, who would it be? Because I suspect 39 people, there may be 39 different answers to that question. I hope there is. Because if you have to look around and say, oh, not him, not her, definitely not that one. Well, I guess we'll settle on the one in the back. That's about as good as we can do. That's a bad scene for the church, right? But there should be so many people that if I said, who would you want to imitate in this church? If you looked around the room, it's like, I can't make a decision. There's 39 people in here today, and every one of them's a good choice for me to imitate. That's what we should strive for. But that's when we're thinking about examples, we should be looking at them along the way. So who is your example? Jesus? Old Christians from the past? Current Christians today? I'd say the answer to that should be yes, all three. Whose example are you? Well, let's turn the questions around just a bit. Whose example are you? Well, first of all, is it other Christians? Are you an example to other Christians? Because we just talked about that here just a moment ago. Your brothers and your sisters in the Lord are watching you, and you need to not tear up the speaker while you are presenting. That would not be good. Okay. There are people that are watching. Don't imitate Daniel as he walks around with this cord hanging low. You're about to electrocute yourself probably if you do something like that. But if you are an example to other Christians, we have to be mindful of the example that we put forth. Titus chapter 2 and verse 7, in all things show yourself to be a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, and incorruptibility. Those are things that we need to carry with us along the way. We have to have a level of integrity if people are going to follow us as an example. We have to show reverence in the church. We have to be incorruptible if we are to be an example to other people. So is it other Christians? Well, it might be. Is it young children? You know, we said at the beginning, the children will naturally look to their parents, right? Children naturally look to mom and dad grandparents, whomever it might would be, as their example. But they're also influenced by other people. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 18 and verse 6. Jesus said, whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Let's think about just that verse for a minute. Whoever, meaning it could be any of you, causes one of these little children to sin. Now think about that number. That could have been 5, it could have been 10, it could have been 100, or it could have been 1,000. Whoever causes 1,000 of these little children to sin. But that's not what the verse says. It says whoever causes one. Okay? Well, odds are we're not going to make 1,000 people but we can cause one really easy. And when he said, whoever causes one of these little children to stumble, causes one of these little children to sin, said it would be better for you to have a millstone tied around your neck. Y'all probably been to there's a place in Gatlinburg, right? The old mill, the big old stone, but even smaller millstones. I don't want any of them tied around my neck. But then if you take me and throw me into the sea with this big thing tied around my neck, essentially it's all over. Show is over right there. And that's the example that was given by Jesus in Matthew chapter 18 and verse 6 for causing one person, child, to stumble. Now think about that for a second. That's a lot of pressure. But we are asking, whose example are we? And if children are watching, then our example has to be positive. Our example has to be good. Our influence on children in the congregation is pivotal. Well, whose example are you then, perhaps? Could it maybe be unbelievers? Well, odds are that most people that you encounter in the community, most people that you encounter in your workplace, most people that you encounter in your neighborhood are probably not in this room right now. They may have some various level of Christianity. They may have some various level of belief, but they may not have any at all. Those people are perhaps deciding to follow Christ based on your example, based on what you do. We should be mindful of 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 12. He said, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. What he's saying right there is when they talk about you, it should be a promotion of God. But when somebody talks about you and they say, I've never seen anything Christ-like in him. I've never seen her do anything that seemed even remotely Christian. That's a poor example. If you're around somebody for very long and they can't tell through our behaviors, what we are, we have to be an example to those folks as well. So let's ask the question then, whose example are you? Is it other Christians? Is it young children? Is it unbelievers? The answer should be yes. All of them, just like it was on the previous. So the question is, what kind of example are we? And I told you that we would have here at the end, and you don't have to answer anything out loud, but I do want you to consider these questions. We have 3 questions and then we have 4 questions right here. And I want you to think about in a quiz show, on a game show or something on TV, if you get the question right, you get a certain amount of points, right? Or you get a certain amount of dollars or whatever it might would be. But if you get the question wrong, you don't get it. On Jeopardy, you lose money. You know, if you say, I'm going to risk $5,000 on this question, I get it wrong, they deduct the money from you right there. Well, we're examining our example. And I want us to think about these questions, and I want us to think if the answer is yes, we're putting a few points in. But if the answer is no, we're taking a few points away. So let's look at the first question. Is your example helping or hurting other Christians? See, you can answer this, but I can't for you because you have to consider it yourself. Is the answer to this question yes, it is helping other Christians? That's good. If the answer is no, it is hurting other Christians, that's bad. But we said a minute ago, Paul said a minute ago, that people should be maturing constantly, right? So maybe our answer here is yes, but it could be better. Question 2. Is your example helping or hurting progress of the church? Growth of the church? Success of the church? Yes or no? Helping or hurting? Is your example helping or hurting the cause of Christ? What am I doing that's benefiting the cause of Christ in my daily life, in my daily interactions, in the work that I do, in the interactions or the communications that I have with other people? Is it helping or is it hurting? We have to examine our example, right? Maybe this question is more on a continuum with helping over here and hurting over here, and we're sort of always moving along on that line. But forward progress is always better than negative or backwards movement. 4 questions to go home with. If every member provided the same example as you, would the church be strong? If all 39 people here today was doing the same thing that I'm doing, how strong would the church be? If every member provided the same example as you, would the church be growing? We've all known of churches that grew, and we've all known of churches that shrunk, churches that have reduced, churches that don't exist anymore. You can drive around our county here and see churches that were there and that are gone for various reasons. But at some point, that organization, that entity, that group of people stopped growing. It may have been because of the examples that were put forth by the people. If every member provided the same example as you, would we have church on Wednesday night? I don't know. It's important. It's important for us each time that we have an opportunity to come together, to be together, to be able to worship. That's important, but also the ability to interact with each other. Because I will be quite honest with you, the time between Sunday and Sunday, I see far fewer Christians in my day-to-day life than I see on Sunday and Sunday. And so Wednesday night becomes sort of, as Ben has often said, that sort of bridge that gets me over the troubled waters to get to the other side, right? It's sort of that rejuvenation. It's that energy drink, as it were, for me to sort of push through. If every member provided the same example as you, would the church even exist? Now think about that for a second. Would the church even exist? I said a minute ago that there are churches in our community that don't exist. The building's still there. You can drive by it. Church isn't the building, though. Because that building will be turned into something else, or it'll wither away and fall down. There may be people camping out in there. I guarantee you there's raccoons in there. But would the church even exist? The church is us. The church is the people. The church is the 39 people that are here and the several that aren't here as well. And if every member provided the same example as you, would the church exist? Oh, yeah, the building frame will be here for a long time. But the frame is worthless if you're not sitting in here inside of it. But it requires every one of us setting an example for others for the church to be able to grow. But it also requires us to examine others out here and say, I want to be more like her so I can be an even better Christian. And I want to be more like him so I can be a better Christian. Because if all of us are modeling ourselves after other people that are strong Christians, it's going to make us stronger Christians as well. And if every single one of us is a stronger Christian, then by definition, the church is going to be stronger. But you can't expect the church to grow if you're going to let the rest of everybody do the work and you say, I'm about right where I am. We got an email the other day from the superintendent of schools. We always get one right before Christmas. And he always writes a really nice letter. But he talked about some of the things that we've done in the district the last 3 or 4 years and some things that we've changed in the district the last 3 or 4 years. And he said something to the effect of, when we do the same things that we've sort of always done, we get into a habit. We get into sort of a routine, but we stop challenging ourselves to grow. And he said in this letter, he said, I'm going to go home this couple weeks. And he said some things at my house that I've sort of always done. Why am I doing this? Why do I do it this way? I thought about the church when I read that, actually, because I thought, if we're not careful in the church, we can sort of fall into that same habit, that same routine, that same, we've sort of always done it this way. But if we're not challenging ourselves, we're not going to improve. And every one of us wants the church to grow. We wouldn't be here without it. But I'm not necessarily talking about numerically, but I'm talking about spiritual growth. But my spiritual growth relies on me. But I'm using you as examples for who to follow. And that's important for us to know. I'm leaning on you, and you are leaning right back on me. We have to examine our example. Because if we don't, cease to exist. Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Everybody that I ever want to imitate is only because they're doing things the right way. And they're doing what would benefit the church. If there's anything that we can do to help you improve, whatever it might would be, as always, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.